States. Cool. Sorry, just getting that out of the way. Look, what do we think the context for this is? It's the context that I told you earlier, right? We tell you it looks like the bad parties have been removed, good parties have been endorsed, and there has been just like massive coverage of this. And further, we tell you that newer issues have arisen. We tell you this is like just inevitable on a global stage. Here are 5 reasons that continued pandemic coverage is really bad for policies that get passed in this context. First, massively reduces voter turnout. We think this happens for 4 reasons. First, we just think like a lot of these people, even though they think it's the major issue that occurs, are also just a bit burned out by it because they've been hearing it repeatedly, right? They're really fatigued with this and they're really tired about it. But second, we tell you this means they're also fatigued with the political parties that are being reported on. Because these political parties kind of need to cater to the media landscape in order to tailor their policies to public perception, these parties are only putting out policies that directly impact COVID, and as such, it's like are predominantly focusing on those COVID policies, and as such, they find it really really difficult to get excited about policies. But 3, we also just tell you that the virus is no longer as dangerous to the vast majority of people. We tell you this is partially due to early mismanagement, meaning a lot of vulnerable people are no longer able to be vulnerable, but also just due to increased levels of vaccination, which means that people are less likely to be concerned about it. As such, we see massive voter disengagement. Second, we just tell you that votes are being wasted. If people are voting based on their pandemic preferences, this likely disagrees with their current preferences, right? We tell you this looks like the New Zealand Labour Party being re-elected on a pandemic platform, but actually but facing significant domestic opposition to its actual legislative policy. We tell you looks like similar things in the United States occurring and other nations. As such, people are continuing to vote because of this media coverage in a way that is really harmful to their actual interest. Third, substantially different issues require different solutions, right? Like in the pandemic, you needed stimulus to keep the economy going. At the moment, when you've got massive inflation, you need to cool down the economy to stop stagflation occurring. When you've got an issue of global isolation and you aren't able to trade effectively, that's a different issue to when you've got a war that means you need massive global cooperation to support Ukraine. In general, these issues require mutually exclusive policies. 4, we tell you that when this media makes this change, the voters are likely to follow and put pressure on political parties to change with them. Note, this means they are likely going to be able to have oxygen to deal with these new issues. And 5, we just tell you COVID issues are no longer really able to be responded to because the COVID pandemic is predominantly no longer the major factor. Lots of policies are set in stone. What do we think this means? 1, low voter turnout, that's really harmful. 2, bad policies are being passed. And 3, it's unlikely that there's an alternative out of it. Moving now into political polarization. Now, a lot of what I just tell you also applies under polarization, but there are several unique things here, right? Like we tell you that the 2 extreme groups that I've told you about in setup are likely going to believe that are kind of relitigating the issue end on end. We tell you this is largely supported by media support. But further, each group hates the media that doesn't align with them, right? Like they believe that the media in general is likely going to be of the other group is, hyperpolarized, not going to be the issue. And third, we tell you this is being used to springboard these groups into further extreme positions because they are now polarized and disbelieving any media that doesn't fall into their group. How do we fix this? We think it's really clear that at the point the media doesn't follow along with this narrative, they're likely going to bring these people along. People are going to think they're more neutral and more objective, but further, they're going to allow people to be optimistic and positive about policy, which reduces polarization in general. It is really clear the world's challenges are no longer the challenges of COVID. We need to move to a world where we can face the most pressing challenges.
Hi, just give me like 5 seconds. I'll set up my timer and stuff.
Yeah, all good.
Cool. Can you see and hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I will start. Yep, we'll start in 3, 2, One, the worst mistake side affirmative makes in this debate is ignoring the impact that the pandemic has had and still continues to have on minorities all across the world. That does lead to actually lesser voter turnout. You have to focus on the issues that exist. Before we go into why affirmative's case is just principally and practically not justified, I want to note a few things on responses. First, the premise of their case is that people do not care about other issues because they care about the pandemic. But I want to note that the pandemic is actually a gateway to caring about other issues as well, i.e., the fact that people who come from rural areas and children who go to rural schools don't have access to digital resources was shown by the fact that they couldn't go to school and they couldn't actually attend school once classes were shut down. The fact that you don't have housing and there's a large amount of poverty for workers is shown by the fact that migrant workers in India had to walk thousands of kilometers back to their house because they didn't have the means to go back and do so, and they didn't have homes to live in. You can actually find all of these issues through the pandemic as well. We actually think that's a lot more effective because everyone's mind is focused on there generally. But second, I don't think polarization in general goes away, and I don't think affirmative ever proves that it goes away. Because even in the US, polarization exists for a number of reasons. You have culture wars over things like trans rights, over things like education within school boards, for example. You have issues like whether structural racism currently exists within that area. You have cults of personalities within multiple parties that continue to exist. Polarization will still exist on their side of the house. They never actually prove why that goes away as a whole. But third, just note, the largest problem with their entire case is that it's massively restricted. It's restricted to developed countries that had absolutely great policies that dealt with things like COVID. That is countries like New Zealand. However, most countries did not have that. Developing countries completely botched up their way of dealing with COVID. That led to massive amounts of death. That led to massive amounts of economic disruption and massive amounts of harm for millions and millions of people all around the world. This is not just developing countries, but also developed countries like Singapore, other countries over the world that weren't actually prepared to deal with things like the pandemic because they didn't predict something of that scale would actually continue to occur. That's where the debate really lies, and that's where side negative comes into this round. What are a few things I'm going to do in this speech? First, I'm just generally going to start with framing, because what does this look like? It's not just op-eds are written and people talk about this. What do they say in the content? The content of that is to say that the state is not responsible for it, that nobody is responsible for this entire thing. Let's just move on. There's other issues to deal with. What does this actually look like, right? And why does the state necessarily come in? The state comes in because most of the policy dealing with the pandemic came from the state. Things like mask mandates, vaccine mandates, lockdowns, all across the world, but because of the fact that the state used that coercive power to actually talk about these things. So you have to explicitly mention the state and then remove all reliability and responsibility from them when making that argument. That's what the media essentially entails to do. Why is this an extremely bad thing? The second reason this is generally bad is that in developing countries, this essentially allows for whitewashing. What does this look like in developing countries, right? In terms of framing, it looks like, for example, in India, the Modi government completely botching up things like the supply of oxygen cylinders, completely botching up things like transportation for people to go back to their houses, massively shifting, for example, shutting down large parts of the country, shutting down things like workplaces, and then not providing the healthcare resources, adequate facilities to people on time so they're able to get that help. That happened in countries like Malaysia, India, developing countries all around the world. These are the most important stakeholders in this debate because on scale, these are the people that were most affected. Developed countries had greater amounts of resources. They were able to cope with it much better. What are the impacts of this and why is this not justified? First, on a principle level, this is not principally justified because it leads to the whitewashing of suffering of many millions of people. Note what the pandemic did, right? Not only did the pandemic directly kill millions of people, i.e. it deprived people of valuable family members, for example. Your children died, your parents died, a close friend of yours you knew probably died to the pandemic. It also led to the closure of small businesses and the loss of millions of jobs because of the fact that these small businesses didn't have financial liquidity and capital to actually continue operating when they were shut, and they therefore could not actually continue within the long term. Therefore, millions of people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds lost their jobs and couldn't actually continue. But it also looked like, for example, massive scale disruption of life. Even people who survived were left massively mentally scarred. So being locked up in your house for 24 hours a day, not being able to go down, for example, not being able to meet friends and family members, had a large amount of effects on people's mental health. This is actual, real, tangible effect that people felt at a direct proximate level. That proposition, that affirmative just wants to whitewash completely by saying that, hey, this is not important because let's move on. Because let's just be clear about this. The current situation does not adequately account for the fact that these people suffered. Why is that so? Number one, people who were promised things like compensation for the loss of family members, for example, haven't got it. For instance, the Delhi government said, we're going to pay you 1 lakh for every family member that you've lost, but that hasn't come to many people. Number two, the fact that you don't get the kind kind of closure that you generally require because of the fact that this discourse, the affirmative concedes the discourse is still continuing. That means there's still interest in continuing that discourse. That means there's a principal reason that discourse is occurring, which means that you want to satisfy that happens. The point at which victims do not get that closure because you completely whitewash it, meaning it's completely principally unjustified. I'm not sure that they can completely deal with that. But third, you are reparative principled obligation to these individuals because state failure is actually what led to their failure in the very first place. It is not the individual's fault that they had to this massively suffer. It is the state's fault and the state has to repair for them. The moment at which you whitewash this, you make that possibility completely go away because you go on to other issues. I think that's a principal harm in and of itself that they cannot justify. Second, this leads to massive practical impacts as well. Because note the framing. COVID cases still continue in many parts of the world, right? China, for example, had 40,000 cases just yesterday, literally. You see countries like India, for example, my university just had a breakout like last week. What this generally shows then is that a cavalier attitude develops if you stop talking about these kinds of things because people stop wearing masks, people stop doing things like sanitization, and they don't stop caring about these things. That means current COVID that's continued to happen. That means more and more deaths are likely to occur within the general future because of the fact that COVID still continues. You're still likely to get hospitalized and you're still likely to get people die. Even if it's not in a scale as massive as what has happened before, these are still completely avoidable deaths. So if you focus on this issue particularly, that's the most important impact that generally exists. But no, third, this extends to future pandemics as well, right? Because note, if you have things like an antibiotic crisis, we're having a large amount of antibiotics leads to a large amount of mutation. If you have things like, for example, structural reasons where you have unregulated interactions between animals and humans that leads to diseases like Ebola, monkeypox, and COVID coming up. For example, wet markets in China and Southeast Asia generally are still open in most parts of the world, even though COVID originated from a wet market within like Wuhan. What this generally means then is you have future pandemics and you have less preparedness for future pandemics because the discourse currently is still focused on what present victims are supposed to get. Only if that discourse continues are you able to focus on what future victims have to care about this as well. This is extremely crucial because the fact that you're going to get some kind of medical breakout or an epidemic or a pandemic of some sort in the future that's going to lead to the exact same things that are happening right now. The only way you can stop this is by continuing this current conversation and by making that awareness spread to a very significant extent. If you make that awareness spread, are you able to actually stop those future deaths in extent? Why are these future victims so important? Number one, they're probably much larger in number because the human population is probably going to increase. Number two, they're not aware, they don't consent into all of this, which means to say they cannot take measures right now that would stop them from getting hurt within the near future whenever they're faced with that pandemic instead. I think it's just cruelty and principally unjustified for people in the present generation to just perpetuate that into the future when people in the future do not agree to it and do not give you a clear understanding of it. But just generally then, this also leads to larger and larger amounts of awareness. Because let's be clear about affirmative's case. Affirmative's case is that voter engagement is somewhat lesser because people have pandemic fatigue. Number one, there are many single issue voters who care about the pandemic. They lost family members. They lost their job. They want to vote on basis of the pandemic. The fact that they concede that pandemic is a massive thing in voting means that people should care about this, and you lose those people the moment you move on this particular point of time. But second, you have other reasons to actually care about this thing as well. Minorities suffer from the pandemic. Minorities get that fatigue, which is probably not comparative on their side of the house, but it's comparative on our side of the house because you're able to then restore that trust, because you're able to grant them that closure, uniquely or negative. We're so proud to oppose.
I thank the first negative speaker, and now I'd like to invite the second affirmative.
Can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear.
Perfect. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Not once in that speech did we hear how beating the dead horse of COVID actually achieves any change. Because look, it is terrible that families lost loved ones. It is terrible that their governments didn't look out for them, but what we're doing with this discussion is only making their lives worse, right? Because the limited amount of political appetite that people have is eaten up by reflective discussion that's getting nowhere for solutions. Because while it might be terrible that you lost a family member, what your single issue hot button voting is right now is the fact that you don't have a job, is the fact that that job isn't enough to feed your family, is the fact that you have all of these other issues existing. I think it's quite clear how we won the debate because we told you how we address those issues better. three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to bring you back to our case and explain how we reduce political divisiveness and political apathy, also how we improve policy. But before I move into that, I'm going to just respond to their principal push. Okay, their main principal push, which was basically the only existing path to victory that they have, which is that people deserve closure for all of the terrible things that happened to them during the COVID pandemic. Four responses to this. Firstly, this being a successful principal push is dependent on there being a practical or somewhat productive outcome from this. But newsflash, it's about a year later since there's been major outbreaks and there still hasn't been any meaningful change. Those countries that were able to achieve things like healthcare reform have done it, for example, New Zealand, but those countries who will never be able to achieve healthcare reform or never be able to achieve healthcare change, like the US, like other countries, are doing nothing but hurting their voters and hurting their citizens by continuing to talk about something that they will never reach an agreement on. But secondly, outside of if they want to talk about how it makes people feel, it makes people feel really sad and depressed and not listened to when we're reflecting on a period in their lives that was probably really traumatic. The fact that they don't have that family member anymore, when all of the news reminds you about that, that makes you feel really unhopeful about the future and you feel like there is no way forward. But thirdly, there's more pressing issues at the moment, right? And these existed during the pandemic. They were right to highlight that sometimes we learned about those because of the pandemic, but the problem is people have lost their appetite for those issues because people keep linking them to COVID and they see COVID as an unsolvable issue or an issue that's already been moved beyond. The comparative on our side is if we keep talking about those issues in isolation from COVID, we might actually be able to reach a solution because people understand that those problems still exist. But fourthly, we've reached a point as a world where we've done what we can about COVID, right? We've got vaccines, we've got medicines, and we're able to ship those around the world. It's unclear what more we can do to make the COVID pandemic better other than, lock things down again, which people agree is not something that they want to do. The other push was that it draws attention to other issues, and I'm just going to explain why that's actually flip that and explain how it happens better on our side. Firstly, they aren't discussing it anymore, right? We might have learned about the education disparities and the poverty issues about schools and kids during the pandemic, but that conversation is halted at the point where people still associate that with the pandemic, right? The comparative is on our side. If we have that political window open where people can talk about it as separate from COVID, those camps won't get infuriated with each other and blame each other for that happening in the first place, and there will be able to be solutions created for that. But secondly, reflective perspectives and reflective discussion, it's unclear how that produces an actual solution. And that's the main idea that they have to actually explain if they want to have a chance at second negative, how any of this discussion achieves anything other than what we told you, which was political apathy and voter and political divisiveness. Okay, why does this our side reduce political divisiveness? Because the context that went unresponded to is that people have already made up their minds about the pandemic. And that's firstly, that there's a very, very strong camp that believes that open policies were the way to go and that any lockdowns, any school closures were really wrong and really evil and should never have happened. But secondly, the other side believes exactly the opposite, and that people who believe that compulsory vaccines or compulsory lockdowns were a really effective thing believe that anyone who wanted to open up faster is really evil and should be punished for that. But that criticism of those two camps isn't productive or isn't necessary anymore. Why isn't that? Firstly, we told you COVID elections have already happened. People have ousted the government that caused the pain or tried to push them to do different policies if this were ever to happen again. But secondly, we literally just cannot change the past. What happened in COVID and what governments did at that point has already happened. We have learned from those mistakes, or hopefully the governments will be able to learn from those mistakes. But thirdly, I already told you the healthcare reform boat has already sailed, right? If countries were going to do anything to their healthcare systems in reaction to COVID, they have done it in the case of New Zealand, or they will never do it in the case of the US. What does this mean then? It means that continuing retrospective discussion firstly only encourages these camps to bash each other, right? Instead of talking about, okay, here's what we might be able to fix about it, they say, oh, well, that was actually caused by the other camp, and it's really evil that they continue to have that opinion in the face of the the outcomes that we've seen. But secondly, it also encourages each camp to make their ideas more radical in order to engage the audience on an issue that they believe is boring. It looks like Republicans, launching into conspiracy theories about how government control has extended from lockdowns to QAnon, or it's extended from lockdowns to literally government spying on you at every minute, and people are getting sucked into that at an incredibly dangerous rate. But on the other side, it looks like, other opposite making conspiracy theories about how these Republican commentators or Republican senators are like literally the scum of the earth, and it only serves to make people angry at each other. That means that in order on our side, when you have people being able to discuss issues outside of the pandemic, they're more likely to talk about things that are productive, think about imagining a future that is more positive, rather than beating a dead horse and expressing their hatred for the other side. Okay, why does this then also improve the pressing issue of voter apathy? On our side, we told you that there are very pressing issues that have emerged as a consequence of the pandemic, but we cannot fix the cause of it that has already happened. Those are the cost of living crisis. That are the social issues in the South, or like literally the war on abortion or the war in Ukraine, which means that we need our politicians to be talking about those issues and proposing actual solutions, rather than blaming the other side for being the cause of that issue and then retracting any responsibility or any action that they can actually do to fix the issue as it stands now. The current narrative means that firstly, all of this limited appetite that we have in the media for political discussion is being spent on sides blaming each other, which means that instead of people tuning in to decide, where they should vote or how they should vote, they just see blame rather than solution, and they tune out. They stop watching TV, they stop engaging in politics, they stop thinking about how they might be able to imagine a different future. But it also means that all of these politicians evade any responsibility, right? They stop being good at their job. They stop actually writing any legislation. They stop going out and, campaigning properly so that people are able to vote in a way that changes their lives. What this means is that people are missing their voices heard. The point was that minorities did not turn out at the midterm election, that people who need the changes the most, that people who need the cost of living crisis to be solved, that need the war of Ukraine to be solved, they aren't being heard, and that is causing definitive consequences. The impact on policy on our side is that at the worst case, you get people feeling a little bit more happy about life because politicians are talking about a future where we're leaving the pandemic behind. But the best case, where we win by 10 points, is when we prove to you that politics, become a little bit more civil, become a little bit easier to navigate, and that improves the world drastically. Incredibly proud to affirm.
I thank second affirmative. I'd now like to invite second negative.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. 3, 2, 1. You, as a minority, a Black African person in Harlem, care more about the war in Ukraine, that is literally thousands of kilometers away, than a literal loved one that you lost recently, is the most ludicrous claim that I can hear in this round. Few things then, just to clarify the frame, because I think this affirmative team largely muddles it. They use it conveniently. They say, well, it's eating into voter appetite, that's why it's a big issue. Then they say it's not as important, that's why it's a small issue and people are okay to move on with it because we have fixed it. Both of those things can't be correct, which means we're being more charitable here. That is, this issue exists on a spectrum. You can't delete this issue simply because it's something that's important, something that's affected people. What they do is they delete the issue, point at which when you disseminate the information through pandemic amnesty, say this is not a big problem, that's why you delete this and not consider it as an issue anymore. That's the most charitable framing that came from us in the first speech. Why is this then important in the most vast majority of instances? Because I want to challenge the frame again, because they say people have been accountable, governments have been kept accountable, we have been able to move on, policies have been implemented. It's largely Western centric, it's largely centered in Australia, New Zealand and Western countries. We told you why that can't happen in the vast majority of instances, and it's not that we asserted the frame that's going to happen in developing countries. The weighing metric that they did not respond to is because, one, People in the developing world were more vulnerable. They had less access to resources. They had less access to, say, for example, oxygen supplies when your relative was dying on the bed. Secondly, there are more deaths that happened in the developing world. Like there were literally like cement, like funeral pyres were overflowing in Delhi. Literally, you could not have places to bury coffins in Brazil, which means these are people that these are countries that suffered more number of deaths. That's why they need to essentially ensure that accountability is ensured in the future. On scale, on vulnerability, we told you why that context is more important. But even in the developed world, note, it's only individuals in the rich elite areas who got away with it. Minorities such as the Hispanic community, Black African Americans, disproportionately suffered from the pandemic when they did not have access to proper sanitation, who were homeless and on the streets of US on the outskirts of city, did not have access to proper hygiene, did not have access to proper masks, could not socially isolate themselves because it was just not feasible for them to do so because they lived in cramped housing. Those are individuals also in the Western world that were affected. And I think, which means they only restrict this debate to rich individuals in the Western world. That is entirety of the stakeholders. They have not engaged with anything else beyond that. First argument, then I'm just going to rehash what Debayan said and why this essentially is important for victim closure that is independent of practical benefits. First thing to note here is I think point at which when you essentially move away from it, like do pandemic amnesty and say like, well, the state was not culpable. Debayan says why the state needs to be held culpable because this is a state that essentially perpetrated and pushed forward those policies. The problem is that people are essentially more sadder and like they are alienated with the concept of the state when you essentially feel that the state essentially does not recognize what the problem was, recognize the death of their loved one, recognize that even like say for example the job that you lost during the pandemic, which means at that point of time it creates more amount of alienation with the state, creates more amount of mistrust that the state is not likely to listen to me. I think that's a more harrowing experience. That's a more isolating experience because you feel that the state does not serve justice adequately. This is really how the criminal justice system works. You want to essentially ensure victim closure. You want to do investigation on crimes that have essentially happened simply because of the fact that the victim has the principal right to essentially have that investigation of a wrongdoing that has occurred on the victim. That is the reason why investigation and justice principally is justified, like on and of itself, because forgiveness simply can't happen in the absence of justice. That is the principal flaw in that case in the first place. But secondly, this means, and this is problematic in terms of a precedent that it sets, because Debayan tells you that this pandemic is likely to repeat again, because they're saying that, oh well, and this is the response that they have on the second speech. They say like, well, things have happened in the past, that's why you can't do anything of it. That misses the point, because we told you specifically from the first speech that this is likely to happen again in the future, simply because one, we told you wet markets across the world still continue to operate in China. They're deregulated simply because of the fact that one, people cannot change their dietary habits. These food attributes are like tied into cultural things that individuals opt into. There's huge amount of political pressure to ensure these wet markets operate. They are great economic sources for these countries, especially like Thailand, who literally sell exotic food as tourism for people who come there, which means wet markets are less likely to shut down across the world. Second thing, in terms of globalization, when you have a more interconnected economy in which people are traveling from one place to another, one pandemic breaking out in China can literally wipe out populations in Italy, which means at that point of time, this creates a greater precedent for this to happen subsequently, which means at that point of time, like given the fact that SARS happened in 2002, you did not implement measures, that's why it repeated again in 2022. That's the reason why the huge propensity of the future pandemic happening means you need to be better prepared for the future. How do we do this then? First, in terms of principle, this is more relevant because you ensure greater compliance with the state, because point at which now individuals know that the state investigated, looked into what the problem was, looked into the death of my loved one, paid me compensation adequate to essentially what I've lost, or essentially gave me a government job in India, say for example on the death of the loved one, which means there is more compliance with the state from the next pandemic or in case of a next emergency, because the trust with the state is higher on our side of the house. The state literally moving on from the most vulnerable and saying, well, it's okay for you to do so, which means there's a more amount of like correlative, more amount of coherence with the state that you largely generate on our side of the house. But secondly, I think secondly, you're likely to get better policies through, and this is why it's important. Because note here, most of the things are very difficult to implement. This way, literally taking them at their best. The reason why to keep continuing the conversation is because most of the policies have not essentially been implemented in the developing world, and that's why you need political pressure to do it. Look, they don't have any comparative on their side of the house. I'm just going to like watch their case, because they say like we should continue to talk about other productive issues. Well, there is like bipartisan clash in those issues as well. Point at which if you want to put socialist welfare policies, Republicans are always going to like oppose that simply because they feel that's more socialistic. Like the war in Ukraine, literally Germany is divided. Right wing believes that we should continue to export gas because that's literally driving up the prices, as the left wing feels that we should adhere to like so democratic principles of the EU. So you cannot actually get also like the deadlock breaking on their side of the house in terms of welfare policies. And I'm not sure how you're going to solve the war in Ukraine. That's too far-fetched. Why don't people even care about it? I'm not sure. Which means at that point of time, they haven't proven why their issues are likely to be solved, why their issues are important, why their issues reach any kind of efficacy on their side of the house. At best, it's negative neutral, because the same problems they identified happened on their side of the house as well, in terms of policy deadlocks left and the right in deadlocking on certain issues, which means on our side of the house, you at least get victim closure that is exclusive on our side, a trust with the state that is more exclusive, and people are likely to care more. Then they go ahead and say that, well, I'm also going to argue, and this may also like the spillover benefit that Debayan argues is important here, because Debayan tells you that a gateway to understand other issues is through the pandemic. The reason why we feel this frame is also important, because one, this affected you very recently. The war in the Ukraine doesn't affect you. Like other nebulous things that they talked about doesn't affect you. Literally 2 years when you have to stay under a lockdown and literally ensure that your life was affected to this extent, you're much more likely to care about it. It's more proximate. You shared similar lived experiences with other individuals, which means you're more likely to care about these things comparatively more. Which means, say for example, lack of digital infrastructure in India that made less people opt into digital technology, or say for example, hygienic conditions and sanitation that was important to ensure in villages so that like future pandemics don't happen, but also just to improve the general living conditions of individuals at large. Then they say perhaps you don't have a job, you perhaps lost the job because of the pandemic, and ensure that you essentially either get the job or ensure that government rolls you out a compensatory government job and those things, which means it's important for you to maintain that pressure. And we told you why COVID has spillover into other things as well that people care about, and that's the reason why you should ardently take this into consideration. The last thing to then say here is, I think, in terms of like getting more amount of accountability and passing of the policy. And I'm going to be very charitable here, even if they say that there are going to be deadlocks, but I'm pretty sure this can be done at a micro level. This is to say, like, if people in Texas think that, say for example, lockdowns affected their mental health, and people in Delhi and NCR feel that like you need to have more stringent lockdowns to prevent the spread, or you need to have better like oxygen infrastructure, they can vote on a local level. You have got local municipalities that can essentially do. You can essentially hold local referendums to determine in terms of what people want in those micro spaces or in those particular constituencies. I'm unclear why there's always going to be a deadlock, like you're fighting in the Congress and the Senate. Probably the solutions can obviously be implemented at a way more micro level, in which you like build more hospital beds in that constituency. You build essentially more oxygen infrastructure. You improve the sanitation literally in your neighborhood. Those are things that you can more proximately do, easier to do, and easy for individuals to conceptualize and do. You cannot solve wars in Ukraine. You can't like fix the economy in a certain neighborhood or constituency. You can do so at a very micro level, which is solvency mechanisms are also easier on our side. For those reasons, neg.
Hi, thanks, second neg. I'd now like to invite third affirmative.
Awesome, just checking that I'm audible.
Yep, loud and clear.
Lovely, just give me a few seconds to organize my paper and start a timer. Cool, starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, before I get into the thrust of what this debate was about, I'm just going to explain what you already believe, and therefore why you believe we've already won because of what they didn't engage with and what is far too late for them to only begin engaging with at third neg. That's the fact that we told you that when the media shifts away from focusing on COVID issues, necessarily something has to fill that void on the political talk shows like 9 a.m. interview slot, and what is filling that void is people talking about issues that actually impact people now. This wasn't the war in Ukraine. We told you that this looks like the fact that every country in the world, including vulnerable developed countries, but also just impacting like poor people in developed countries, is the fact that we have inflation, is the fact that that leads to a cost of living crisis that is directly impacting people's way of life. It's impacting if they can literally afford food for their kids. I think that's really important, and I think we should have the media focus on something which is actually able to be changed rather than COVID. It wasn't good enough for their only response to the entire positive material from our case, which was about the fact that we're able to switch the media onto this and talk in a more constructive way, was when it literally after 8 minutes of second neg, they just say, you can't fix economic problems in a neighborhood. That is literally what elections are for. You can vote for good economic policy, and I think that that's particularly important. We told you that it's really harmful when people don't go out to vote because they feel like the media and therefore what the election is about isn't what's pressing in their pockets, isn't the fact that it's talking about things that impact them like cost of living, and that especially impacts the most vulnerable minorities who already have systemic barriers to get out to vote. But it's also a harm when you have people who do buy into the media media narrative and do buy into the fact that politicians are having to talk about COVID because the media is pushing COVID and therefore are voting on COVID policies rather than voting on policies which impacts the most, the thing that is currently impacting them the most, which is probably things like cost of living. It was so damning for their case that they never engaged with this. Cool. Moving on then to whether people care about COVID, and then subsequently, can we actually change much about COVID, even in their best case scenario where people do care? But the first thing I just want to flag was that they said there was a tension in our case, but I think they just didn't understand what our case was. Because we didn't say that people, are caring about COVID to the point where they're not voting for different issues, but also that people don't care about COVID. We said the fact that the media is focusing on COVID means that necessarily that's shaping how politicians campaign and it's shaping how people are forced to engage. But we tell you that people actually don't want to be engaging with COVID policy because of this fatigue, because of the fact that the past 3 years of political dialogue has been on this COVID policy. What are 6 reasons why there's political fatigue and why people are over COVID and want to be focusing on issues that actually impact them, like cost of living? Firstly, the fact that, as we told you from first and didn't have a response to, almost everywhere has had an election. That's because the pandemic started 3 years ago. Most places have an election cycle that is 3 years. Maybe it's 4 years, but then there's a 75% chance they've had an election. Just on the grounds of probability, probably like 180 out of the 190 countries on the planet have probably had an election where they were able to sort out everything about COVID. They could vote out parties that did badly. They could keep in parties that had good policies and say that's what we like, or they can shift the strategy and vote for parties that have good ideas. They've already sorted out COVID. Secondly, it's the fact that there's just been so much coverage. When every single day on your TV at 7 p.m. news, the first story was that there's 10,000 cases, you get sick of the fact that every day you're seeing the exact same news story about COVID, you're over COVID. Thirdly, it's the fact that your views are set in. We're 3 years into the pandemic. If you so strongly believe that you don't want to get the vaccine, you're not going to change that. So when you have people talking about whether it's good to get vaccines or whether we should have vaccine mandates, that's just makes you fatigued because your views are set in. The hearing about it for the 30th time doesn't change your views. Fourthly, there's political coalescing. That's to say that party strategies and party strategists now know what the average voter cares about, and so they probably have similar policies. That means that people don't care about COVID because there's only minor differences between the two main parties. Fifthly, it's all of the material about other issues. That's to say that there are post-COVID issues like geopolitical issues, but also pressing things that do directly have an impact on people, and so people do really care about, like inflation resulting in the cost of living crisis for people around the globe. And finally, that's to say that a lot of people have now caught COVID, they felt fine, and they think that COVID was overhyped by the media. Those are 6 reasons why there's COVID fatigue. Most of them were delivered earlier in the case. It wasn't good enough for them to just say that people do still care about COVID. What was their push? Their main push is that people do care about COVID in places where it was managed badly and in developing countries. 2 responses. Firstly, that's to say that places where it was managed badly still had elections. That's to say that Brazil was still able to remove Bolsonaro, and places like Australia were still able to remove ScoMo. That applies to both the developing world and the developed world. It wasn't clear why they made such a big distinction between the two of them. It's probably operating similarly if they are a democracy, and if they're not a democracy, then obviously this whole debate doesn't matter because the media doesn't influence who's in power. But secondly, sure, people might care, but you probably can't change because most of the discussions about like where a country managed it badly is just retrospective. That's not a productive discussion as you're voting for like a government's past actions, not policies that they care about right now. Just because a party managed COVID badly doesn't mean that they shouldn't necessarily be punished for it in a second election after they got voted out because of doing it badly, because it probably was just the fact that it was a new crisis and they didn't have policies fully worked out. Thirdly, as they tell you that it's really good for victim closure. Note that at the moment, this is their only path to victory, since it's like their principal material that's independent of the practical stuff, which I've already explained why that doesn't matter. I just think that people have had closure. It's been 3 years. Secondly, I think we can wait it away if you're suffering now from things that are tangibly impacting you, like inflation, meaning that you've got less money. But thirdly, I think it gets far worse because you're still hearing on the news about what killed your mum every single day, as opposed to hearing hearing positive stories about good ideas that politicians have to solve current crises, you're still focusing on the past. That doesn't bring you closure. Fourthly, they tell you it's really good because it's a gateway to other issues. But I think you're much more likely to vote if you're focusing on the actual issue. That's to say, you're more likely to care about and to go out and turn out and vote when politicians campaign on the idea of we need tax cuts to help cost of living, rather than the COVID stimulus caused inflation, which caused the cost of living. I think that it's far better not to use COVID as the gateway, but to actually just focus on the current issue itself. All of their things about like COVID highlighted other issues. You can just focus on the issue directly without the COVID lens. Right. But can we actually change much about COVID? But that you actually can't. And that was their burden to prove. And we gave you so many responses at first and second to say you can't. We said that if old promises were broken, then A, you already had an election to get rid of them. But secondly, if a government broke their promises before, they'll probably break it again, especially now that there's less voter appetite. Secondly, in terms of future pandemics, this also depends on political appetite. I think it's far better to have a break from this discussion, come back in 20 years when there's the next pandemic, and now people are fresh and ready to hear about COVID policies rather than still being stuck in the fatigue status that we proved down the line. As well, that means like just because COVID's everywhere, I think the fact that vaccines are out there and like the fact that we obviously can't go back into lockdown because of predictions of a recession and things like that means that you actually can't change what the policies are. Therefore, even in their best case scenario where people do care about COVID and that's what they want policies to be shaped by, these policies can't actually impact it. It's far better for people to be hearing about things they care about so they go out to vote, and then when they go out to vote, they're able to implement good policy that is able to benefit them and stop crises that they actually care about while also reducing political division. So proud to affirm.
I thank the third affirmative. I now like to invite the third negative.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right. All right, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The absurdity of Gov case in this debate means that you should never have like trials of a Holocaust, or you should not just build memorials and ask people to move on because it's the thing of the past and don't talk about retrospective things. They need to realize that in developing worlds where a migrant worker died because of COVID, they literally his wife has to work 3 jobs and the children are not being able to send to school because they don't have to can't make ends meet. I think those retrospective debates are literally the living present of these people in those countries. They can't go ahead and whitewash this particular idea, and this is where they falter. We tell you that this particular amnesty is a way to whitewash and not talk about these issues going forward. But just some extraneous rebuttals to the idea of, hey, listen, COVID elections have happened. They've already voted people out. I think first, that's empirically untrue because BJP is still in power in India. It literally faced the entire COVID and it's still going strong in state elections. I'm not sure why that's always going to happen. It probably only happens in those countries where voter turnouts actually like people vote on just single issue and they are not persuaded by things like Japanastic jingoisms or like cult of personality, as in the case of India. So I'm not really sure why this particular model or idea of COVID elections works in all countries primarily, except New Zealand or Australia. But secondly, and this is the more important claim here, I think at all points when people know that even if they vote the person out of power, they know that the trickle down of the new government coming in and starting a welfare scheme for them and giving them the benefits that they voted them in for is a long drawn out process, right? I think the blame game that I talk about in the framing of their debate also exists symmetrically because they'll say, hey, listen, the previous government fucked up. I think we need time to go ahead and make sure the reparations come your way. I think to that extent, what we need is immediate solutions. As a person, I don't care care if a government comes into power and makes some economic policy that can solve the problems 10 years down the line, right? I need to make ends meet right now. And this is why discussions need to happen right now. The mechanism that we give to you from second speech and first speech onwards, or why this will work, is because it becomes a vote bank issue and politicians then go ahead and engage with it. Why will they engage with it? And why discussions happen on the first in a good way for that matter, right? But before that, I think the first thing you need to note in this debate, and this is the way to adjudicate this debate, right? I think this debate talks about the media and what it should do and what it ought to do. I think media has an obligation towards people. And this is the weighing of our arguments that I'm going to come to. Media has an obligation towards people, specifically the most vulnerable, to solve the information asymmetry that exists so that people can meaningfully participate in the democracy at all points of time, right? I think the most vulnerable people need this information gap to be like shortened or closed down the most in the first place. That means they vote for the most proximate issues, and that is why the most proximate harm that they have ever faced is COVID, because they literally lost their jobs, they literally can't make ends meet, and they also lost their family members. It's the most proximate thing to them because it happened in your own household and not something at a nationalistic level, like government saying, oh, we'll make a new economic policy, we'll send a rocket to moon, and we'll just strengthen our military. Those things don't affect me in a more proximate manner. These things do. This is where media has an obligation to go ahead and talk about these things so that power asymmetry can shift to an extent which is good for the economy, for the democracy at large. This is why I tie back the idea of why you need to build public trust, and public trust is the only way to go ahead and sustain a good democracy. I think the mechanism for people to opt into it and not just say pass blame onto each other in these kind of debates is that politicians always want to go ahead and hedge their their canvassing or their campaigning on the most hottest topic that exists in media, because that will get them the most amount of traction, because if everyone's talking about it, they want to talk about it. The reason why it necessarily works better than any other thing that the Gov tells you, it's because of the idea that because of the idea that will happen in a good way. Why will it happen in a good way? There are three reasons for this, and this is the weighing of those arguments, right? Firstly, I think all people suffered in COVID. Everyone suffered. That means it was something that existed throughout classes and cultures, and it did not matter if you're a rich person or a poor person. That means it becomes an even better topic for politicians to talk about and opt into in the first place. So I don't think it will just stay restricted to them passing the blame in these debates, but rather the incumbent will be forced to act on it, primarily because it cut through classes and cut through cultures and cut through the traditional boundaries that people make in society in the first place, right? Secondly, I think the kind of appeal COVID has, even in international sphere, because it affected every country on the planet, I think it already means that the incumbent is already under a lot of pressure, primarily because so many countries are talking about it. So many countries face a similar problem for the first time ever. I think this means that even the incumbent will be pressurized to act on it and not just pass blame. I think at that level, the idea that Rito talks about becomes important. I think if they say that you have like partisanship and the people just fight on debates, fighting on debates happens even in their world. They never give us any mech to solve the particular fighting and why people like it to just come out to vote when you start talking about COVID and start talking about economic policies or inflation. But on that, and this is where I engage with Gov whips like framing. They say, oh, cost of living matters, and cost of living is the most proximate thing to them. Inflation has happened. The reason why a poor person and a rich person deal differently with inflation is primarily because of the kind of resources they have. A rich person or an upper middle class person probably does not care about a marginal increase in cost of living. However, the poor person cares much more, because for them the increase is immense or exponential to what they were actually accustomed to. At that point, what do you need? You need employment, you need resources, you need jobs. And this is where they fall into the trap of a frame that we gave to you from first speech onwards. The idea is simple. COVID acts as a gateway to go ahead and see these problems, because the lens of COVID just magnifies issues like unemployment and poverty to an extent where you can see things like cost of living increasing or harming people to a greater degree on our side of the house, primarily because COVID exacerbated the problem and brought it to the front of the political arena, and not something that politicians just talk about as a part of their manifesto. It literally became everything about their manifesto, primarily because it exacerbated the problem to that extent. The kind of attention COVID brought to things like unemployment and lack of resources and poor sanitation facilities for people literally meant that you can solve those problems that they want to talk about and solve the problem of cost of living only if you identify the problem and keep on like literally punching the particular dead horse that I talk about. Not only if you can identify a problem, you can go ahead and find solutions for it in the first place. Identification is only a consequence of you continuously debating about it and not talking about like nationalist policies which people are not even proximate to in the first place. This is is where our idea of like trust in the state becomes so very important, because people's daily engagement and daily activities that they do and the way they actualize themselves in society is a consequence of the trust that they have in their state. If you don't have your trust, you're probably not going to participate in a democracy better. This probably means that it can lead to erosion of a democracy in the future. That harm is that harm is immense, because this particular country is functioning on a democracy. I think that democratic principle gets eroded to a greater degree, because as more and more people become disillusioned with the system and the media itself, who has a responsibility towards like curbing down the information asymmetry. I think at that point people just get disillusioned with the system even more. What you do rather on our side, and this is me taking our best case, in a worst case, like you rather go ahead and you push more focus on COVID, because it's a gateway to go ahead and identify those problems in developing nations, which were the most impactful, and they are not clashing with the nationalist policies. Like even countries still talked about unemployment. COVID literally gave them a magnified view of how unemployment works, and this is the delta we try to push on our side primarily on that. I think on scale we're able to impact more number of people, primarily because we talked about the trust of literally the entire country at that point. I think the two things they never responded to, and this is something that goes as an independent part to it for us: one, victim closure, and why that's the most important and proximate thing to them, and why media talking about is the only way they feel that they are represented in the conversation and not a part of like outside. But secondly, future preparedness. Only if you can go ahead and talk about and keep debating about this particular thing, you will realize that the problems exist and the problems still exist status quo. That means you can probably go ahead and prepare yourself better for the future pandemics that are about to come. I think these solve the problem that whatever Gov wants to talk about. I think at that point of time, you talk about those nationalist policies through COVID, and that means you solve the problem of cost of living as well, if that's what they want to push on third Gov. I think for all those reasons, they're proud to take this one.
I thank 3N. I'd now like to invite Neg reply.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. 3, 2, 1. Three things. First, necessity. Secondly, principle. Lastly, on pragmatics. In terms of necessity, this affirmative team tells you that we have dealt with the pandemic well. It's a thing of the past, and we are essentially ensured that vaccines, etc., have been rolled out. We challenged this to you right from speech 1. In terms of it, say that it's far from over. Say like literally there have been breakouts in China. Countries in the developing world essentially haven't got vaccines as efficiently or has not as a huge percentage as in the developed world. We give you reasons why you should buy that frame more, because it affected more people. These were more number of vulnerable people in the world who essentially had less access to resources. That's why ensuring that they principally get justice and pragmatic benefits was more important in the round than people in the developed world. We gave you the frame. But note, they also talked about in terms of cost of living, inflation. These are also things that affect poor people largely. These are not things that affect rich people, which is they essentially agree that this debate is about vulnerable individuals. We also told you why people like minorities such as Black African Americans and Hispanics, even in the developed world, have essentially suffered out of COVID, which is largely operating on the frame and largely being charitable to them in terms of the characterization. Secondly, we told you why. They said like because it's in the past, that's why you should not, like, retrospective things don't essentially matter. You should be positive and move on. That misses the point in terms of the propensity of future pandemics that had no response on GovWeb. They never said in terms of why. We told you why wet markets continue to exist. We told you why globalization means more free travel. We told you why antibiotics in speech 1 lead to more amount of mutations. Fourthly, we told you why you need essentially these things to ensure the future pandemic. There's a greater propensity of future pandemics happening. That's why you need to be more prepared for the future. That was the necessity premise that they did not challenge in the first place. That's the reason why there's a greater likelihood of this happening in the past. In the future, that's the reason why we should be better prepared for it. That's why not disseminate information. Secondly, on principle, which they hardly had any engagement with. Firstly, we told you that irrespective of the consequence, and this argument was upstream of any pragmatic benefits, that victims deserve closure for the harm that has been done to them. That is by the state in terms of failed policies. That's why you want to disseminate information, right? Because the Debayan tells you, you want to like move on. That's the reason why I portray this in a positive light, because of the negativity that happened, which means it's undone on the victims who suffered, say for example, loss of their loved ones, like essentially lost their jobs, or essentially, say for example, had to go through brutal times during COVID. Point at which the state whitewashes this and moves on. At that point of time, it's a more harrowing experience because you feel alienated with the state. You feel like the state did not care for you, and that's why you feel helpless as an individual. They said you can tell them other positive things and move on. But this is correlated with your lived experience. This is not proximate to you, as Angad points out, which means loss of a loved one is more important for me to care, even if, say, if I take that case in terms of cost of living or the war in Ukraine, which obviously they dropped in third speech, which means it's more proximate to them. It's a lived experience that's very recent. It's something that I largely care about more in terms of like That's the reason why we told you, principally, victims should deserve justice and fair, equitable trials and not basically been whitewashed. If the principle is consistent, you should not build Holocaust memorials. You should not have any of those things, not have criminal justice trials, because you can just tell the victim to move on, right? That's why the principle can't really work, and that response is incredibly flippant. Lastly, in terms of pragmatics, firstly, we told you that it's important for you to put pressure on the system, because a lot of individuals have not got compensation, such as, say, for example, compensations for the loss of your loved one, largely in countries that you want to hold governments comparatively more accountable. They said well, you have already voted out governments, but point at which when the media deletes this, at that point of time, that's the frame that they operate. There's very less amount of public discourse and debate, which means this is irrespective of political parties, and people are unaware of these things. You want to essentially have pandemic literacy, talk about this more, ensure that these victims get compensation and jobs. That's why it's more pragmatically viable to you. They say you can focus on other policies. Not all of that things in terms of housing. If you want to give more subsidized housing, that can be seen as a socialist policy by the left, like a socialist policy by the right, and the right wing does not want to give you housing. Like even the war in Ukraine, none of their policies reach any kind of efficacy even on their side of the house, because the same political deadlock and bipartisan deadlock operates on their sides, even in things like cost of living, subsidized housing, war in Ukraine, where politicians are largely divided. At least on our side of the house, we give you 3 metrics where people would care more and co-opt that benefit. One, COVID was more proximate to you. You have spillover effects. That is to say, the very fact you lost your job due to COVID, you can improve sanitations that happened as a consequence of COVID. It's much more easier for people to relate to affected you recently. It's more closer to your lived experience. You can get that policy passed even comparatively faster. We told you why you can also do this at a micro level through referendums and those things. Also, this is more proximate and close to you compared to those things that are way more alienated to you. For all those reasons, neg.
I thank Neg reply. I'd now like to invite Af reply to conclude the debate.
Sweet, just checking that I can be heard.
Yep.
Cool. Look, maybe at the end of the negative case, you think COVID wasn't dealt with really well, and it would be good if we can get some sort of change from that. But here's the thing. If you buy any of the unresponded to mechanism material that we delivered you down the bench about why people are now locked firmly into political opinions with regard to COVID that they otherwise would not be, and if you you clearly understand that any further discussion of COVID is not only not beneficial, but likely counterproductive to delivering any sort of political aim, because it furthers the polarization and an inability to pass effective policy. I'm going to talk to you about principle, then practical on COVID and other pandemics, and then on other issues. No, on principle. They told you a lot of things here, but they all are contingent on actually proving a practical outcome. At no point did they try and respond to the fact that people are locked into their firm political views. At no point did they try and respond to the fact that they're at loggerheads. As such, you need to buy any of the practical material for this. You need to buy a lot of the practical material for this to exist. But second, we tell you that we told you very clearly there's a countervailing principal obligation to do what you can to support these people. For all the same reasons that they're vulnerable, you should care about having policy that delivers the best outcomes to them. And third, we told you that these issues are now tarnished with COVID, and as such, they're likely, you can't do both. Trying to seek compensation and support for these people under COVID likely makes it never going to happen. Now, finally, they said, oh, but in some cases, the elections didn't vote out the bad parties, or they haven't had a chance to vote it out. No, if they haven't had a chance to vote it out, we tell you likely the next election is the COVID election, unlikely if you buy any of their material that it's not going to be. In the case of states where they voted in parties again that handled the pandemic badly, we tell you at the point the population thinks we told you really clearly, if the population thinks it was handled well, it was handled well. For a team that cares about democracy, clearly unclear what they talk about. On principle, they don't have a leg to stand on. Let's deal with COVID practical, right? They first told you that there are specific policies that need to occur, such as compensation, that just didn't happen. Again, they didn't get around any of the material we delivered to you about why it's inherently unlikely that you're ever going to be able to convince people to vote these policies through. But second, we told you why fatigue and hyperpolarization mean it actively unlikely to get these types of policies. As such, it's clear that you do not deliver polarization. Now they told you, oh, but some haven't been held to account. We've explained to you very clearly why at the point someone is capable capable of being held to account, they probably have been. No, it wasn't enough for them to just like assert, oh, but we thought bad parties were elected. They needed to explain to you why specifically populations were voting in, were endorsing parties that did badly. They didn't do that. Now they told you, oh, but parties need to reach closure. Again, struggles with the issue that they never dealt with, why you can never get change under COVID. And now they try to tell you independently, but future pandemics are super bad. We need to deal with this one well so we can build public trust and things like that. Note, this again falls down to the same issue. There is a bit of a theme here that because they never dealt with the context that COVID is uniquely polarizing. What do you still believe at the end of this? You believe we've dealt with it as well as we possibly can be. Note, that isn't perfectly. It's as well as they can practically be attained, and that vaccines and other policy changes mean that there is not likely to be any further worsening of this pandemic. Likely what has happened well. Okay, now onto other issues. They told you that this is a kind of a gateway issue that drags people into the discussion. Look, we told you really clearly it also locks people out of the discussion because they get disenfranchised. They get to a point where they're fatigued and tired after 3 years and don't have any capacity to hear about it. Now they also told you, oh, but other issues don't have personal impacts. It's pretty clear that inflation and other issues like that actually do have personal impacts on people. Note, when it's not directly attached to COVID, however, they are uniquely not fatigued, they are uniquely not locked out, they are uniquely able to believe about it. You didn't hear any response to our material about how we get better voter engagement or how we get how solution-oriented positive beliefs means that people are more likely to vote for parties, are more likely to engage and deliver good outcomes. That means they clearly lose this debate.